Podcasting is easy, they say, but little did you know, I recorded 5 or 6 intros like this one before I actually published one. So, for every hour of podcast that you record, it actually takes hours upon hours to publish one. And this is what we're talking about on the show today, among other things. My guest today is Stewart Alsop. He's the host of a podcast called Crazy Wisdom. And by now, Stewart has recorded almost 400 episodes. I really love Stewart's podcast because he uses it to learn. Whenever he finds something interesting, he just invites the guest on the show and they talk about it. It's fascinating. And Stuart started a new thing as well that came out of this podcast. It's now called Crazy Wisdom Offline, where Stuart interviews executives in order to help them articulate their vision and their stories to their teams. So if you want to sign up for that, quick plug for Stuart, you should reach out to him now and talk to him about doing an offline podcast just for you or your team. But anyways, this podcast throughout takes on a number of turns. We end up talking about life in San Francisco during the pandemic, the hippie scene in San Francisco, what it was like for Stuart to live on a farm and have farm animals, what it's like for him now to live in Buenos Aires, Argentina. We talk about crypto, podcasting, and who knows what else. So I started editing this conversation at first and decided against it. It's long and it's good and I like it, and I think you'll like it as well. So just tune in, take what's good for you, leave the rest, and enjoy this conversation with Stewart Alsop. And of course, if you have any questions, comments, please email, comment, whatever. And I'd love to hear from you. I'm doing it for fun as well, and I hope you like it. Cheers. Tell me, like 366 episodes so far, what have you learned? What was the motivation for starting this podcast back in the day? What have you learned? And what's your motivation now, aside from, making money from the offline version?
So 2017, 2008, best friend, Eric Levin, he is a programmer in San Francisco. We were in San Francisco and we were going to the Oakland Ecstatic Dance. And we would go in my van every Wednesday night to Ecstatic Dance. And I was very much a rationalist at this point, kind of more on the hardcore materialist side. And he was much more the hippie side, already embedded in this. And we would have these really interesting philosophical discussions as we go across the bridge to Oakland, which was the most far out of the Ecstatic Dance kind of thing. So like, women without clothes, without, tops on, dancing, people taking all sorts of herbal extracts and other types of extracts, and like just total madness. Like the conversations you would get in there would be full of conspiracy theories. So I started I wanted to understand what was the relationship between this world and the technology world and the hardcore materialism, the science, all that stuff in the Bay Area. I started with the theme, what is the relationship between stress and creativity? And so what role stress plays in the creative process. And so the first probably 150, 200, because everybody told me you need to have a theme. And so that was the most broad theme that I could figure out that still interests me enough that I could do it. But since then, I've kind of not really stuck into that theme either.
So Crazy Wisdom, the name came from that hallucinogenic party with dancing. Is that kind of like
yes? So the name did come on that on one of those van trips across the Bay Bridge. The Crazy Wisdom. I was like, okay, I'll call it Crazy Wisdom. Do you know where? So I didn't come up with the name Crazy Wisdom. Do you know where it comes from? So it's a Tibetan Lama by the name of Chongyam Trungpa. And Chongyam Trungpa is a Crazy Wisdom Tibetan Buddhist who came to very close to you, Boulder, Colorado, and set up a university there. And he was a total raging alcoholic and did all sorts of crazy things. And so this is the name for a sort of spiritual discipline in Tibetan tradition. But we in the West also have a similar tradition. That tradition is called divine madness. And so basically it's the idea that, rationalism, and it's funny that I named it because now I've been in 2020, sort of we were put head first against the irrationality embedded inside of rationalism. Like there's a limit to where rationalism can take you in certain aspects of reality. And so Crazy Wisdom is kind of that. Like it's like, it's not linear. Nothing's linear, although it may appear linear, basically.
Interesting. So you had this fantastic experience, and you decided that let's go learn some more about the world. I'll put it on a podcast. And what was it like to invite the first guest?
Oh, yes, yeah, that's the good reminder. So that's the craziest thing. It's probably I don't know how I don't know if Spotify keeps I think they limit the amount of episodes, but if you go back to the first guest, it's a great story. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna start this podcast. I got this little room inside of my place on Fell Street, right next to the Panhandle and the Golden Gate Park. I got my own little room that's a guest room that I can use to interview people in this thing. And so I'm like, okay, who's going to be my first guest? And this guy comes on. This guy posts on Facebook. One of the people in my large acquaintance kind of thing. He posts on Facebook. Last night I had a spiritual experience motivated by cannabis, where I was smoking cannabis and I look outside of my window and I see a homeless guy. But in that moment, I saw that he was Jesus. And so I went outside. I left all my keys inside of there. And I couldn't get back into the apartment. And this was a spiritual crisis that lasted 3 days and put me in the insane asylum. And this guy was a founder who like was part of the 2015, 2014. Like there was some startup incubator that was really, it was like Y Combinator at the same time. A Y Combinator was really kind of like high degree of social proof. The people that got in there were serious individuals and such. And so this guy posts about this on Facebook, and I was like, oh, wow, that's an interesting story. Would you like to come on the Crazy Wisdom podcast? And so he was my first guest. He came over and very soberly, very intelligently described the story that he had. And then he ended up like, his story was so interesting because he became an Orthodox missionary, or an Orthodox Christianity. He was like a Protestant WASP type of guy, and then he got really into Orthodox Christianity. And there was a monastery up in Northern California, and he actually started buying up a lot of the property around the monastery, and it's probably set up some sort of place up there. But I lost touch with him. He kind of disappeared. At one point, he had rented an office in the old Amoeba Records, and he wanted me to provide yoga classes in this Amoeba Records. It's like that fancy from the 1960s. I wanted it, but there something happened there. I'm not sure what happened.
So whatever he took was really strong.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, is it didn't need to be. Well, okay, yeah, that was cannabis. He did take cannabis, and I don't know if you're familiar with this. This is actually a common thing that a lot of, particularly in the high THC varieties of cannabis causes psychosis quite a bit, and it's not really talked about.
Interesting. I'm not familiar with it, but that explains behavior around San Francisco. But it's also, I find it interesting that while you were in San Francisco and you were in the middle of this tech scene, right? It was still booming. I'm assuming that's before San Francisco became kind of unlivable for a couple of years. And yet you found this hippie scene that sounds like something from the 80s. I guess it still exists in San Francisco today, but you don't see that.
Not only the world.
In my imagination, this is what San Francisco was like back in the day, and then it all went away underground, and you found it.
No. So that's the crazy thing I've learned, is that it's actually pretty common in San Francisco still to this day. So it's like a rehash of the 1960s. The 2010 to 2020 in San Francisco was actually it was like, what would happen if you gave an engineer a bunch of psychedelics and then took them to San Francisco, and they're all trying to get jobs at Facebook and Google and meet all the right people. And so then there's this vibe of San Francisco where you all go to the center, you go to ecstatic dance, and you talk with people. And those people all work at Facebook and Google and all those other companies. So like, it's a hippie thing, but it's also very much it's part of the tech world. The tech, like Burning Man is a perfect example of this. That's all this thing that we're talking about. Like Burning Man is it, and that's also how they all get jobs.
So what you're saying is the secret to getting hired in San Francisco is you find one of these parties, and after a few days, you're friends with one of the managers who's like, man, I really dig your style. And next thing you know, you're working on like AI at Meta somewhere.
Yes. And I mean, there's a couple different ways to do it. Some go through the hardcore technical interviews, but yes, there is a pathway to going to get a job. I don't know if it still exists to this day, but the funniest part and the kind of thing that is so interesting to me, because I felt it in San Francisco before the fall, was that like this place has lost whatever was there, and then in 2020 made it really clear that was, for me, had lost it. But like there was a performative nature to it. So everybody is trying to do the hippie thing and work on their soul and show their expression, but it's all sort of with this ulterior motive of meeting the right people so that they can get inside of these organizations. Maybe that's my conspiracy theory, but that's yeah.
Well, the theory is probably right. I mean,
Yeah.
I certainly know founders who raised 2, 3, 4, 5 times, for the companies that all kept failing just because they're very likable founders and they hang out with the right people. And eventually, I mean, I don't know how many times in a row you can pull it off, but you can definitely do it a few times. But do you, from these people, like, is it 80-20, like 80 people, 80% are there to hang out while 20 are networking? What do you think? Yeah, I mean,
great. So this,
they're literally networking, right?
Yeah, so in this discovery, and then later on, as both of us moved out of that area, I ended up in a place called Nevada City, and Nevada City, California, is like the ecstatic dance. Like if you were to live at ecstatic dance, or if you were to live in Burning Man, you would go to Nevada City, and it's like that all the time. The farthest out of the hippies all congregate there, and they also have all their weed farms, which all were destroyed because of the change in regulation in 2016 or whatever. So there are two types of hippies. There are urban hippies, and then there are back to the earth hippies. And most people don't know that the sort of, and there's also the bohemians who kind of hang out with the hippies. And so most people don't know that in 2020 there was essentially a war between the cultural war. The cultural war also divided the hippies between the urban hippies and the rural hippies, the back to the earth hippies. In the 1960s, there was a conservative reaction, or it's probably better to say the 1970s. There was a conservative reaction to the hippie movement in the Bay Area. A lot of them got kicked out, and a lot of them left, and they started setting up little farms all over California. So Nevada City was one place that they did this. And so there's the back to the earth hippies, and then there's the urban hippies who actually stayed in San Francisco. Among those people, that's where the performative stuff is. And if you think about it and you extend it, hopefully we don't have to go too politically here, that also kind of led to a lot of the performative things in the pandemic too, as well, like the wearing of the mask, the doing of the things, all those types of things.
Oh, that's an interesting look at it. So we're taking a bit of a detour, but like I said, I think it's a conversation. So we'll detour for a while, then eventually get back. But tell me, you moved out to basically a farm in the middle of the pandemic. Tell me about that experience. You went from San Francisco booming tech to boom, all of a sudden you're in the middle of a farm raising goats and what's that cool bird, the emo? Is that what you've got?
The
Like the
emu,
one with the big beak
yeah.
going, like yeah. What was that like?
Well, that was crazy. That was all a very, very interesting time of my life. And so as I mentioned with the podcast, with the crazy wisdom, I was very much a materialist, and I was very much a rationalist, and I was like very into provable phenomena and evidence-based types of things. And I've said all the right words. And then 2020 happened, and all of a sudden, like that world didn't seem as appealing to me anymore. And so I was left with a choice of as I moved, I made a very quick move. As soon as the lockdowns came in place in March, I was like, I'm out of here. I'm not going to stay in San Francisco. I'm moving up to Grass Valley, Nevada City. I'm going to go in my van, live in my van in the woods. But I needed internet. So I ended up moving from my van and I found some property up there. And so that happens to be a place where there's a bunch of conservatives. It was the one place where it's the one county in California that seceded from the Union and joined the Confederacy. So everywhere else in California all joined the northern states. This one county, Nevada County, which is in California, joined the Confederacy. So there's a strong conservative bent coming from my rationalist progressive. Those people were like demons basically, so I couldn't really hang out with them. But there were also the hardcore hippies and the back to the earth hippies, all of whom the pandemic barely even touched, because they
in the same place we have the very relaxed hippies and the demons conservatives. And
Yeah.
I'm assuming you mean like the folks who ride a big truck with a big Confederate flag,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
spit out smoke, those guys.
Yeah. Yep. They have
Interesting. And
my friend lives there. They have monster truck rallies. All of that exists there. And I found out that they're not demons at
they
all.
both coexist in the same county.
So yeah, yeah. So
That's pretty good.
those are only two of the groups. There's also the retirees. So there's a bunch of retirees all over the mountains of California. There's a bunch of retirees, and then there's also the weed growers, and then also were urban hippies. Probably I would have been considered an urban hippie at that point, who were realizing that they wanted to spend less time in San Francisco, and that movement had been going along. That's why I know there's a war between these two groups of hippies, because the people from the Bay Area also, a few months after I moved up there, they started moving there as well and started bringing the politics there as well. But the conservatives and the back to the earth hippies got along totally fine. They were there during the pandemic with all the crazy stuff that happened. There were some skiffs and stuff like that. Something about countryside. Yeah, careful.
Yeah, just a point of clarification. So again, so there's the conservatives, then there is the back to earth hippies that are just hippies, and there's like the new hippies from San Francisco who wants to come and liberate the land that nobody wants them to liberate. Is that kind of the thing?
Yeah. Which happened in other places, not only in there. Yeah.
All right, so you're in this strange but vibrant place. You're doing your podcast. At this point, do you remember like roughly how many episodes you've done?
And I took a break. That I lost a lot of the subscribers because probably because I started talking about the COVID pandemic as well. But there was a point at which I stopped. The pandemic kind of stopped me from, because it shattered my understanding of what was real. And so there was a point about 6 months where I did take a sort of hiatus. That wasn't planned or anything like that. I was just like, I don't know what I'm doing here. And then when did I start it up again? I think I go check this out. But yeah, I basically started it up, and I can't remember when I started it up again. And let me go check my.
But let's just say, you started it, but what was the desire for restarting it at that point?
That's what I'm trying to figure out. I'm trying to figure out when I restarted it. And
was it before the chickens or after?
Definitely after. So that's an interesting story in and of itself, which I'll go to. So I have this land. The only people that I can have for renters are the back to the earth hippies or the conservatives. But at that point, I didn't really understand the conservative side. So I started renting to the back of the earth hippies, which caused a lot of crazy problems, which I won't get into right now.
No. Get into it. Like I said,
yeah. Okay. So basically, so back to the earth hippies, 1960s, 1970s. This is also where the underground psychedelic movement happened. So a lot of in the back to the earth hippies are also doing sort of psychedelic therapies. And one guy who I rented to was a very charismatic guy. He was actually from the Central Valley of California, but he had appropriated a hippie name, like an Indian name, and claimed indigenous roots, and then was offering 5-MeO DMT sessions. And 5-MeO DMT is one of the two most intense psychedelics, and he was offering it to veterans. And he was a very interesting character. And told him that he couldn't do certain things inside the house. He kept on doing he's offering the services, and like when people go on 5-MeO DMT, they have like very somatic experiences that are very loud, and people yell and scream and stuff. And so he's like disturbing the other tenants. And then he hosted a big party. It was like a really interesting thing, because I was like this father figure, and he was like a child acting out, and it was a really interesting dilemma. So he actually squatted on the property and tried to take it over. And he invited all of his passive aggressive hippie sort of indigenous medicine, psychedelic medicine people to come do their things as well. And they were all super passive aggressive and tried to team up on me. It was quite a thing. And I was like this evil landlord guy. I played that character. And so,
is that the point where you made friends with the Republicans, with the trucks, so they can come and help you out?
So that is the shift I started making, where all of a sudden I was like, okay, wait, these guys are totally insane, like totally nuts. not grounded in reality at all. Let me start to make some more inroads with the conservatives. And so I started hanging out with the Christians who have some, all the beliefs about evolution and stuff. And I started to, that's the interesting thing about the pandemic that really changed my viewpoint on talking to people, because that was one of the really strong values that I got from the Bay Area was inclusiveness and like including people. And then, but it's only within a certain rationality, right? You only include people that have the right opinions. If they don't have the right opinions, you don't include
if you
them.
like them, you include them. But if you don't agree with, screw those people. They're stupid. They're crazy. Whatever.
So I started investigating a lot of these threads, and one of those threads was the deep hippie conspiracy theories, and then the other threads was which are crazy. A lot of them are really crazy and distract from the real stuff that's going on there. And then the other thing is the Christians. I started hanging out with more Christians, and they have some interesting theories as well. And then there's like the conservatives who are more conservative from a philosophical standpoint, and that's probably where I'm at now. So I finally got that renter out, and then somewhere along the line, my friend in the Bay Area, she was in one of those houses in like Fremont or whatever, and she had 2 goats and a sheep. And her landlord found out about them because they were shitting all over the place. And so hopefully I can swear on this podcast. And so she's like, hey, Stewart, I need to store these animals for a night. I know you have some property. Can you take them off my hands for a night? And then a U-Haul showed up with a bunch of shit in the U-Haul that the guy cleaned out and stuff. And then out walked 2 baby goats and a sheep. And then ended up staying with me for quite a few nights, not just one night, but nights. All of a sudden, I'd been gifted these animals, and so I was like, okay. And so I should preface this: I had become a prepper in 2020, so I was convinced that the world was going to go much different than it actually ended up going. So I was trying to figure out how to live on this land and like organize the land so it could provide me with and I was a horrible gardener, like really bad gardener. And so then these animals showed up and I was like, okay, animals are interesting. And I actually loved it. I loved the process of having animals. But then it was a rainy night in November and right as winter was coming, it was really rainy, and I was keeping the sheeps and the goat out in this dog pen that was right next to the cabin that I was living in. And it was a very rainy night. And then all of a sudden I hear this sort of like at 4 a.m. I'm woken up by this cat-like noise, this of thing, and a shattering of metal. And then so I quickly awake, and then I look out the window, and there's a faint glimmer of green eyes. And then I turn on the light, and there's a mountain lion with one of my goats hanging from its mouth. And here's a great story too. So I was like, okay, wait, there's a wild animal. Okay, gun. I got a gun. I'm out in the forest. And I was like, okay, I have this gun. And of course, me coming from the city, I thought a gun is a handgun, but in the country, you need a rifle. A handgun is only used against people. For animals, you need a rifle because you're farther away from them. And then by the time I had gotten the gun, he had disappeared with my goat. And so I was left with 1 goat and sheep. And then I was like, okay, so I can't just leave them out, or else this mountain, all these predators are going to attack. There were also bears up there and stuff. And so it's okay. I've got to figure out a way to protect them. And then I had to replace the goat. So I had found another baby goat. And it was really funny because when I got the baby goat, I would take it into town. It was a great conversation starter. I would like keep it and I would just go walk around and talk with people.
Well, what do you mean you had to replace the goat? This is a
I lost
natural occurrence.
Well, I lost the goat to the mountain lion, so I had to get another goat to keep my stock of animals. I don't know. I think I was just
What was your plan? I mean, like you said, you were a prepper at that time, so it means like you could get like goat milk and turn your sheep into like wool. Make some clothes from it.
Yeah, and both of those I went into those. So the problem with goat milk is that once you have to get the goat impregnated, and then after they're impregnated, then you have to actually milk them every morning, or else it's a sort of abuse. Because if they don't get milked, there's a lot of pain and stuff like that. So then it turns into every morning you're milking the goat, and that was quite a commitment. And so I decided not to go them that way. And so then I got the other goat, but they were sort of like a this is animals, in a situation that I could eat them if I wanted to. The goat milk would have been good if it was going down that path, but ultimately it was just kind of fun having animals. And I'm going to do it again down here. The land is very cheap down here in Buenos Aires, and I'm going to set up some land eventually and get some animals again because it is pretty fun. So long story short, there is a kind of a detour I could go on, but I want to be respectful of the time. So I ended up I've discovered there's a new form of science that I had not heard of called redneck science. And so redneck science is like in the countryside, to get something to work, there's like a mystical understanding of the way that you get something to work. And there's all these tips and tricks and everything, but you can only find those out through either the experimentation or talking to people who live in the country. And so I was
So you mean if you live in the country and you're just living your life and you learn to do things because you learn them from like your parents or your neighbors, and that's something totally in the city living now.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's called redneck science. Is that
right? Yeah, there's also bro science.
Nice.
There's redneck science, there's bro science. So there's all these sciences, but I'll focus on the redneck science. And the redneck science is basically I was in a grocery store and I was complaining about my recent loss of my goat to a mountain lion. And so somebody was like, "You should get an emu." And I was like, "Wait, what? What's an emu?" And for those, I ended up finding out what an emu is. And an emu is part of the ratite. It's large, giant, flightless birds. The ostrich, the emu comes from Australia. The ostrich comes from Africa. And then down here in South America, they also have their own called the rhea. And this is just an interesting insight in general, which is that there's these all in the Southern Hemisphere, there's these same birds, same structure of birds, but all of whom split off from each other millions and millions and millions of years, and then also lost flight. So all of them lost flight on their own outside of the evolutionary chain. There's also a 10-foot one in New Zealand. There was a 10-foot flightless bird that when the Westerners got there, or no, it was when the Maori people got there, they actually killed them all. So it's a rat-type bird, and so I didn't know what an emu was when this woman told me that I should get an emu to protect my mountain lion, and she said, yeah, it'll protect it, and she wasn't really clear. The emus have these like 3 claws that are really intense, so like if you get kicked by one, it hurts. The Australian army lost a war to the emus. The emus won the war against the Australian army, which was told to go and fight the emus, and they lost. And so they're really gnarly birds. But I then discovered they can't see at night. So I don't know how they protect against mountain lions because they can't see at the night. The mountain lion's always protecting at the night. But somebody then told me later, it was like, oh, it's because they urinate and the mountain lions don't like the smell of the urine or something. But then I'm like stuck with this idea of an emu, got to get an emu. And then I go into the country feed store to go stock up on the feed for the goats. And there are little baby birds. And some of those baby birds were emus, and I was like,
in the country.
I stumbled on the emu sale, and I'm like, okay, well, I have to do this now. It's like this is a sign, and I have to go grab this emu. But unfortunately, at that time, I was somewhat strapped for cash. You're supposed to buy 2 emus because they're social, very very social birds. So it's sort of like a torture if you buy one. But luckily, I had a herd already, so I bought 1 baby emu. And I merged them with my herd, and now my emu thinks that it's a goat. It's completely bonded with this group, and it doesn't seem too sad. So,
out of curiosity, how much is a baby emu?
$500. So it would have been $1,000 to get. Yeah.
It's pricey, and never mind all the feeding and taking care of it later. Just the baby bird.
And I'm still spending about $200-$300 a month in terms of upkeep and maintenance for this is the one thing I learned about. Unless you have animals for a farm and they're actually making the business of farming requires scale like most of the other businesses. And so if you just have a few animals, it's actually quite expensive.
Right. Because you're keeping them as pets. They're not working your farm. They're not really providing output for you yet. But so right now you live in Buenos Aires and somebody's taking care of your animals back in California?
Yep. Yeah. So I've got my renters. Yes.
And you'll continue doing this as long as you're in Buenos Aires. But I guess as your renters are there, that's part of the contract, right? Like feed the emo, clean the goat poop,
Yep.
thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. They signed up for helping me with this type of that type of work.
So who do you have now? The Earth hippies, the liberal hippies, the truckers, or like the San Francisco migrants who ran away from the drugs?
Yeah, so this is a great insight. Hopefully, they're not listening to this. Well, I won't say anything bad. They're excellent renters. So there's the are the so I was describing this sort of social hierarchy of the hippies, and there's the back to the earth, and then there's this other group of bohemians, and bohemians are different than hippies, and so I actually met uh, the king of all the hippies, who I would call more of a bohemian. And so he was running all the events, and he's doing this interesting business. So he's basically like the chief, the organizer of all of them. He is renting out the main house. And so it's a 4-bedroom house, and he's renting it out just him alone. And he's a great renter. He like fixes things, and he's owned houses for a long time. He knows all about it. He just wants privacy, and we're very much aligned in our values and such. And then in the cabin where I used to live, that's where I've got a young couple who are plumbers and a school teacher, and they're more in the conservative realm. And part of the thing about being a conservative in the country is that everybody knows how to fix things and knows how to do maintenance and all these different things. So it's like, which is much better than the first version, which was like this guy who was totally helpless and except for his main specialty of helping people with 5-MeO
Drugs. Yeah. This is a little tangential, but I was having this discussion on AirChat yesterday. I don't know if you've on AirChat yet, but it's a new app by
You invited me. You invited me.
I did. Yeah. And AirChat's a lot of fun sometimes, right? You get to have this like semi-asynchronous discussions with people. But I was saying, are we going to get stupid now that AI is here and you can ask all the questions? And this guy brought up the point that, okay, well, we got calculators, but we still, need to do math. And then we were talking about gym somehow, and started to think, that's that's kind of like an interesting progression, because technically a lot of people nowadays don't need to exercise, right? Because we've figured out all this technology that could do it for us. But gyms exist. And actually, gyms didn't exist like 100 years ago. Nobody went to gym, right? Because you had to go plow your field. You had to lift heavy stuff for your work. And now we have this thing called gym, which is like artificially keeping you in shape, while the majority of people are completely out of shape. And that's a good parallel to actually conservatives in rural areas, right? Or not actually just conservatives, but really people living in rural areas. You kind of have to figure stuff out for yourself. And it's this perception, in the city, there's this perception that you're helpless, that the government is going to take care of you. All you do is just that one thing that you're good at. In the country, you're like, no, like no one's going to take care of me. There's places like around here in Breckenridge where like you call the police, they're not going to come because they're not there. They don't have a police station, right? Yeah. Like if it's a real emergency, like maybe they'll send a state trooper or something, but it'll take them like a good half an hour to get to you. So, people have guns, people have knives, people have skills, people have muscles, right? It's an interesting environment. So I can totally relate to people you're saying that like, oh, they'll just fix things. It's like, well, how else are you going to get it done? Which is cool, right? If you come back and your house is better off than you left it, that's perfect. All right, so easy detour to a crazy area of California for a few years, right? Let's dial it back to a podcast for a second. So over this time, you're learning from a bunch of people, you're inviting them. How are you finding people you're inviting? And the reason I'm asking this is because I think it'd be really cool if more people had podcasts, or at least got on air chat, right, and chatted with people. But you need to do that with a purpose. And I think purpose is you're learning and your audience is learning. Kind of like right now, we're having this crazy conversation, but I bet there's going to be like little bits and pieces that people will find funny, interesting, insightful, and so forth. So how are you finding your 300 guests at this point?
Yeah, it's mostly from Twitter. It's really interesting. It was such a surprise that cold calling actually worked most of the time, either on Twitter and LinkedIn. And actually, it's probably how I got 80% of my guests. Like probably about 20% came from my network of various people. I also meet a lot of people in the street, and about 4 years ago, one of my friends, Ruben Abergale, he has the Social Animal podcast on YouTube, and he basically teaches people how to talk to strangers that inspire them. And so he kind of started this thing, and so now I actually bring podcast guests in from various places that I meet in the street. And it's really funny because very few people are expecting to be invited onto a podcast when you're just talking to them randomly. And so it really, it's interesting. So yeah, it's mostly through those. And actually I have an idea that I've been thinking about, and I think you'll appreciate this. I don't know if as you've been doing this podcasting, have you spent a lot of time thinking about how you schedule your calendar? Like, you did it. You did it very spontaneously. Yeah, you asked me spontaneously to come on the podcast, and so I'm trying to do more of that because I've been a slave to my calendar for the past 6 years. I do podcasts quite regularly, and but now I'm working on a way to make sure that all of my podcasts are done spontaneously, and it's going to be a treasure hunt. So people are going to have to go through this treasure hunt in order to get on the podcast. I'm not sure if it's going to work, but yeah, go for it.
No, the worst case, you're going to try it, right? But at this point, you've built so many episodes that I think it's cool to have people do something, offer you something in order to get on the podcast. But in terms of spontaneity, yeah, I try not to schedule anything, mainly because I don't prioritize my calendar. It's for the sake of people that I schedule things with, because I've missed things before, and I even got an Apple Watch almost specifically so that I can get only important text messages and calendar notifications on the watch. Great. Because this way everything else is turned off. But if the watch is ringing, I know that I should look down at it.
That's cool.
And
That's
even with all of that, like literally 2 weeks ago, I missed a fairly important thing I needed to attend, right? Because the way it works, I look at my calendar, I was like, I have 10 more minutes, I'm like, I'm just going to do this one. And I for 10 minutes. And like 2 hours later, I'm just like, So that doesn't really work. That's why I try not to schedule things. That's why I was like, hey, you want to come on podcast? Like, now? Because I know now I'm available. And it's just like, it's just easy as scheduling. But it doesn't work for a lot of people, right? Because a lot of people, like, they do live by their calendar and they're used to it and it works. And spontaneity is scary. So, I mean, it's not going to work for everybody, but, it's going to work for you probably. So just do it.
Well, and there's categories of people as well. So there's like a category of people who can schedule in the next month. And then there's a category of people that I've only recently entered because I've just gotten it into so much of a sort of process to get new guests on the show that I'm now booked all the way until December. And so now when I'm booking people for this podcast in November, December, and it's June right now, people are like, what are you talking about? I can't schedule this 5 months in advance. Like that doesn't even compute. And so I'm writing. This is how I got onto the spontaneous, because that started to make me realize about that. And so now I've blocked off every Thursday. I don't schedule anything, and it's all spontaneous. I still have yet. So I've asked people. So now the flow is that I find somebody interesting. I ask them, okay, we can put it on the calendar in November, December, but that's really far away. So if you like to do things more spontaneously, I've reserved every Thursday to do spontaneous. Just give me your phone number, save my phone number in your phone as Stewart calling about a podcast or calling about an interview. And then if you're in a place where you can do it, just pick up the phone. And so now that's my flow. And so that starting in January, I'm going to try to switch my whole life over to that flow, which I think will be really fun, because I although I'm very good at scheduling, I've got it dialed down. I'd rather live spontaneously, I think.
Yeah. No, that's actually a really interesting hack. I like that. It's like, hey, it's going to happen on Thursday, but I can't tell you exactly when. And maybe if you can like say, Thursday 9 to noon somewhere, like, are you doing something? And I would know that I'm like somewhere presentable, right? Where I can pick up the phone. Another hack, and I have this I have friend Bradley, who runs recordeditpodcast.com. I think that's the site. And he's been doing podcast editing for people with millions and millions of listens, right? And I asked him when I was restarting this podcast, I was like, hey, Brad, I want to do this, but I don't want to spend a lot of money because, I don't know where this is going. So what's like the minimal viable thing I should do? And he said, well, buy a lav mic, one of those little things you clip on your t-shirt that they're like $15 or whatever from Amazon. I bought a slightly better one because I got the one that's wireless, and you can have two people talking to each other.
Cool.
And I was like, okay, well, that's cool. I mean, of course, I also got the Shure mic because whatever, it's cool.
Why not?
But you totally don't need this. I did compare the sound quality between the two, and this is a little bit better than the lav mic, right? But he's like, look, lav mic you can take with you. It's tiny, right? So you can go anywhere. You can plug it right into your iPhone if you want to, and just store right onto the iPhone. And the other thing for the camera, like where I'm looking right now, right? This is just whatever the latest iPhone is. Most people already have their iPhones. I don't know if it works with the Lightning cable, but the USB-C ones, you just plug it into your Mac if you have a Mac, and you don't actually even have to plug it in. It just automatically picks it up as an external camera.
Wow.
So with a Mac, an iPhone, and a lav mic, you can set up a podcast with two people pretty much anywhere. And so in terms of interviewing strangers, like if you have a little tripod, which you can put the iPhone on so it's a little bit more stable, you can literally sit with them in a park, in a coffee shop by Bay Bridge, whatever, right? And start an interview. And I think that's so cool, right? Like if you think of where technology was 3-5 years ago when we were like starting podcasting, even the thing we're using right now, right? Like the web recording, everything is so much better. So like for a lot cheaper with a lot less effort, you can create a podcast, go anywhere with it, versus like all the tech and nuisance that you had to carry around before, and like the hours of editing that would take. Oh my god, the time now is so much better. I forgot how we got here, to be honest. But
there's a hack. So you mentioned the hack, and I was talking about the spontaneity. I like this idea of interviewing people on the street in Buenos Aires. It's a very popular thing with the YouTube thing, but mostly it's like those Facebook reels to try to get attention type of thing, like interviewing hot girls on the street in Miami or something like that. But I think there's
I'm married. I wouldn't know it.
Yeah. And so, but I think there's an interesting thing that could be done, particularly in Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires is there's a lot, this is the city with the most, I believe, absolute numbers theaters in the world. So acting theaters. It has the most acting theaters in the entire world, more than places like London. And so like there's a really interesting creative vibe, and also the Argentines are really friendly. It's like already in the culture here that you can start up a conversation with anybody on the street for any amount of time. And most people show up late because they've got enwrapped in really interesting conversations. So there's something that I'm working on. It's still not really well defined, but I will start doing more of that stuff, and like start recording my conversations with strangers and such.
Actually, two things come to mind. One, you should check out YouTube, or maybe I'll send it to you. There's a guy interviewing foreigners on streets of Japan, asking them of basically difference between living in Japan and living in like America. And exactly what he does, like 2-minute reels, that gets a lot of YouTube attention, people, because it's short and kind of entertaining. So you can totally do the same for Americans in Buenos Aires, because, you happen to be not in Japan, but in Buenos Aires.
There's something interesting here that I think you'll appreciate. So not only are there a bunch of Americans here, there are also a bunch of Europeans, and there are a bunch of Russians. There are actually 30,000 Russians here, most of whom are escaping the war, and a lot of whom are basically, they found a loophole in Argentine law, which is that if you have a baby here, it doesn't matter if you have an Argentine wife, just if you have the baby, both of the parents also get a passport. And so the Russians have basically like flooded here, and they're actually flooding the system. But actually today I just noticed that it's winter here, so not many Americans or Canadians usually come down here. But I've been starting to hear more American English on the street than Russian, which was the opposite when I first got here. I heard more Russian here than I heard in English, which was crazy. A Russian investor invited me to come play rugby next week. So I'm in the Russian Telegram group. It's really interesting what's going on here.
Is that why you started learning Russian a few months ago? Because I remember you pinging me, being like, "I want to learn Russian." I'm like,
"Yeah, yeah." So I started learning Russian 4 or 5 years ago, and I still am learning Russian every day, so that I can go dance in St. Petersburg. Obviously, I was planning on going, but then the war happened, and I'm not sure if it's gonna be possible for a while. But then it was really funny because then I was like, I'm going to Buenos Aires. I didn't know when I was coming here that I was going to live here. Now I am living here. But the last thing on my mind was that I would come to Buenos Aires and that I would have ample practice to practice Russian, but it's actually been an excellent place to practice Russian. There are Russians everywhere here, and it's really it's a counterculture. This is the interesting thing going back to the show is that I feel like I'm in 1920s Paris or 1900s Vienna or San Francisco in the 1960s. Like there is something going on here, and it's having to do with the counterculture. Because I'm somewhat disaffected from the United States, so I'm definitely disaffected from San Francisco culture, and like that part of my life is now over, and like that my former home is no longer my home, and so, but that was the counterculture. That was like where you go if you wanted to experience the counterculture. And now Buenos Aires has this counterculture, and it's drawing people from all over the world.
I remember you mentioning somewhere in a tweet, I think that, by the way, I don't think we'll ever start calling it X because then you'll have to be Xing, and that's just weird.
Okay.
But you mentioned that people were actually reading books, and that surprised you, right? Like people would sit in parks and read books. And that sounds like what you're mentioning about like 1920s, 1960s, like life is simpler, right? Is that what you're saying?
Well, and also, so 1920s Paris, amazing counterculture of American and European thinkers. Vienna, like when you had Freud and Jung, like there are scenes that pop up in cities, and you can tell this in the cafe culture. And so I'm having really interesting conversations that are like get really excited and heated inside of cafes here that like if you were to talk about this stuff in San Francisco, you would get excommunicated immediately. But because of the particularities of globalization and Argentina specifically, because not many people know this, many people are aware that after World War II, the Nazis, many of them fled to Argentina. Not many people are aware that the Jews also came here during the World War II because this was a safe haven as well. So it's like not only the Germans come here, the Jews also came here. The Armenians came here. Like
well, we
people
should
have been
clarify,
coming to Argentina.
Did Germans flee to Argentina or did the Nazis? That's a very big difference.
No, the Nazis fled to they're like not the Mossad came to Argentina and killed. I'm pretty sure that I'm not sure if I have not fact checked this, but I'm pretty sure that the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence, has come to Argentina to assassinate Nazis.
Clean up.
Wow. Because they came here afterwards to escape retribution.
Can you quickly tell me, because I remember you moved to Argentina and we were chatting about this, and it was kind of wild because you couldn't use Argentinian currency, you had to use Bitcoin. Yeah. Like, what was it like when you just came from San Francisco and ended up in Buenos Aires?
This has been one of the craziest things. It's also what we've been talking about. It's just like Argentina sort of transcends the global norm, and they definitely do this with politics. Milei is just like he's just like a new entrant to the fact that Argentina never sticks to the global script, so another way that this comes out is that when I first got here, the inflation was out of control, totally out of control. And everything was really cheap because the government also subsidized things. That's why inflation was out of control. And there are capital controls. So I couldn't go to an ATM to get cash. I also couldn't use online payments because I didn't have a specific type of number, like my social security number, but they require it to use the electronic payments here. And so I was stuck in a situation where a lot of people went to Western Union because Western Union has changed so much that they now are can transfer money for relatively good fees. But I just never did that. And a friend of mine told me that I could transfer crypto from Coinbase to these guys. They were called Cuevas. And so there were capital controls that made sure that nobody could go to the bank and exchange a US dollar for the black market rate. You had to exchange at the official rate. And the official rate was far, far below. I believe it was like 200 or 350 pesos to the dollar. The black market rate was 800 to 1,000. So like 2 to 3 times X. Yeah.
And let's just clarify this for the listeners. So what you're saying is that there was a huge difference in rates. And basically there was a normal rate, the black market rate, which is what people use for day-to-day life. But if you wanted to get the exchange from the government, the rate was many times more because the government just wanted to pocket extra money on the exchange.
They were doing capital controls. So they were trying to for 10 years. So something really interesting in Argentina happened in 2001, where the government forced devalued the currency. So basically robbed people's money inside of banks. So like they had all their wealth stored in pesos in the bank, and then the government said, "Oh, we need to devalue the currency. All your guys' money is worth 50% what it was yesterday." So basically, robbed people of the citizens' money. This is like the 2001. This really started where Argentina started to run into some really gnarly problems. Yeah.
So you mean the only difference between us now with the 20% inflation over 4 years in Argentina then is the government wasn't smart enough to drag it out over 4 years. They just did it on day one and pissed everybody off.
Well, yeah. In my opinion, the United States is making the same decisions that Argentina made in the 1960s and the 1970s. What happened in 2001 is just like the reaction to those decisions. We're going the same way. It's going to be, there's no political will to change it. Like it's all going to happen the same way it happened in Argentina. It's starting small right now. It's probably not even that small for most of the people it's probably pretty big. Last time I was there was a year ago. It was getting pretty expensive. And like that's just going to continue happening because there's no political will to stop the money printing. All of this has happened in Argentina. We know exactly where it's headed. It's headed to where Argentina was now, and Argentina. That's what separates Argentina from the rest of the world is that Argentina is the only country that knows they've hit rock bottom and is ready to make the changes necessary to stop this. And so that's like it's the only country in the world with the political will to stop it. And so yeah, back to that exchange thing. It's like so the government was trying to capital control. They were trying to keep the U.S. dollars inside the system, not allow people to take their wealth and flee to banks in the United States or flee outside. And so as part of that, you couldn't go to the bank. The bank would only give you a certain amount of dollars. Argentines know this, and Argentines don't want to save in the peso because the peso is rapidly inflating. So what are they going to save in? The technologically literate made a lot of money saving in Bitcoin. Those who were too scared of that risky asset, because it's a riskier asset, started to use physical US dollars to store their wealth. So they'd make their money and then they'd go buy from a legal black market a US dollar from them and then come it back and stick it in their mattress. Argentina has more physical US dollars than any other country outside of the United States because of this illegal system of a black market exchange, which is totally normal. Like nobody's going to jail for this. So like, yeah, that is all changed now with Malay because Malay has essentially like there still is a little bit of inflation and it keeps on going up and going down and going up again, going down. But the wild inflation has now stopped and things seem to be getting put in order. But it's also quite stressful. The main problem for Argentines is they have not, their salaries have not risen along with the cost of living. So they've removed all the subsidies. They've stopped inflation in its tracks, but the real price of things has increased rapidly and the salaries have not increased to the same degree. So people are really having trouble here economically.
I mean, you haven't been back to US for a while, but if you were, I was just in the Bay Area the other day, and a meal for one, granted in a decent, nice, okay, I should say nice restaurant, but it was a meal for one, and it was $80, right? And my latte was $7, and they also wanted tip. right. So
it's getting expensive there.
It's definitely heading into a strange direction, and I don't think salaries. I mean, if you talk to somebody working, like Meta or maybe even Amazon and Google, they don't seem to notice it because they're like, oh, gee, I'm gonna have to like stop drinking wine every night. But if you talk to normal people or like people who are hustling small businesses, whatever, no, like they're counting pennies, right? They're trying to figure out how to like, and I mean, we have friends who on paper multimillionaires, and those guys are still trying to figure out like, okay, I buy this at Whole Foods and I buy this at Safeway and I buy this at Walmart, right? We're talking about people multimillionaires on paper because they're like, this is out of control, right? So it's definitely going to some crazy places, and it probably at some point,
There's a crazy thing about the Argentine experiment right now is that there's no other example of a country that is dismantling the welfare state. Nobody knows the true cost of the welfare state because we haven't not had a welfare state in a very long time. As soon as the welfare state popped up, that's when we started to get 30 to 40% income taxes. Like it's a sort of a Ponzi scheme where the government is like taking all this money and then buying political power with it and then inflating the currency, and then
Mhm.
and making it like, so we have an experiment now where we can see how cheap life can get if we dismantle the welfare state. And so that it could be quite cheap. Like there's been signs that some of the actions that Malaya is taking are leading to deflation of things. And then you add in the AI part, and the AI part might also deflate a lot of the costs as well, like electricity did.
Because what you're saying is the government is going to step away and let the free market take reign again and see where it normalizes over time.
Well, yeah, and so think about the amount of jobs that the state of California offers. That amount of jobs, like where's that money coming from? It's coming from the taxpayers. So the taxpayer is upholding a whole bunch of jobs. Those jobs aren't
Mhm.
exactly the most efficient jobs in the world. Argentina was the sort of the craziest place where this was happening. They had some really crazy examples of a welfare state. For example, at one point, if you were an Argentine citizen and you went on vacation, then you could go back and get a 50% reimbursement from the government for your vacation. So just like all sorts of crazy
Nice.
stuff. Yeah. It was really because Buenos Aires was this non-aligned country during the Cold War where they didn't really exactly align with the United States, didn't exactly not align with it. And so their whole idea was we're going to prop up the middle class through the welfare state. And similar to what the United States is probably going to try to do very soon. And it's just like, now think of a world where you don't have that welfare state. And that world might be significantly cheaper because you don't have all these licensing things. Like, to become a hairstylist in California or Florida, you need to go through like 100 hours of licensing, like to do it. It's like,
It's
yeah,
like you gotta cut hair. Like, pick up
yeah,
some scissors. I cut hair for my
yeah,
kids all the
yeah,
time. I'm
yeah,
I'm an unprofessional barber.
yeah.
Yeah, no, it's that's interesting. I'm gonna go convince my wife to move to Buenos Aires and have a baby, and then we can have a passport.
We have an AI conference that you can come speak at in October.
I would love to. That sounds kind of fun. So it's been really interesting. Tell me,
Yeah.
do we have to stop at the calendar end, or do you still have some time? Like, can we riff on this for a while? Let me know.
Yeah, we can go for another 10, 15 minutes.
Okay.
Oh, IPM. Okay, interesting. Yeah. We can go all the way. Okay.
Can we go all the way to Argentinian dinner?
We've got my AI Whisperers Club at 6. No, sorry, yeah, Argentine dinner. No, we're not going all the way till 11 p.m.
11 p.m. at night.
Yeah.
There's a podcast idea. Just call it Argentinian dinner, right? Like just do
Argentine
like
dinner.
4 hours of eating and talking. Invite like five. It's like a very long besties, whatever they're called, the all-in podcast, right?
And that is really something. This is something beautiful about Argentina, is that the level of conversational skills of the people in general is extremely high, and like that is the Argentine dinner. What you just mentioned is like, we're going to dinner and it's going to take 4 hours. Like, we're not getting done until 2 a.m. and we're going to drink some wine and we're going to have a really good conversation. This conversation is going to go wherever it goes. Like, it's a very interesting culture for that here.
That does sound kind of fun, to be honest. But, in case anyone's still here listening to about your original podcast, but all of this has been super fun. So I'm glad we took this little detour. But let's try to bring you back for a sec. So you started this crazy podcast, moved out of San Francisco, inviting all these interesting people, basically like whoever you think is interesting. That's actually, I think, how you and I met. I was doing smashnotes.com at some point, and you reached out and you said, hey, I think that's pretty interesting. You want to talk about it? I was like, of course, who doesn't want to talk about it? And we ended up chatting and then staying friends. With what's your biggest takeaway with 366 episodes to date, all these interesting people? You even went so far as, bringing your dad on the show, his friends came on the show. But, like, if you were to give people advice into like, you should start a podcast tomorrow, why?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's like, I remember reading somewhere, there's so many different ways to learn. If you think about all those different ways to learn, what are the most effective? When you're on your own, just kind of like searching the internet, that's kind of effective. ChatGPT now makes it much more effective. But really, like, if you want to learn something, look at what the Europeans did, the aristocrats did. They would hire a personal tutor. And a podcast is essentially asking somebody to come on and tutor you in whatever they know. That brings to mind the other thing as well, is like Stephen Covey has this great framework, which is we move from codependence, which is being dependent on another person in a way that's unhealthy, to independence, and then interdependence. So, but despite what we humans think, it's good to be independent. Like I'm basically libertarian at this moment. Like independence is really important, and sovereignty is really important. But we're always interdependent on other people. Like there's like all the food that I eat is grown by other people. All the things that I do are all enabled by other people. And so the more that you can talk to people and kind of learn lessons from other people, from the mistakes that they've already made, the more efficient, effective, productive you can be. And life isn't necessarily about that either. There's also this like sort of exchange, and there's giving and taking. Because this is a really good question, maybe to bring it back to you, is like who's receiving from this? Are you receiving more than me, or like am I receiving more than you? Like in this exchange, like where does the line drawn? Like who's getting more out of this? Are those listeners? Are the listeners getting more? Like
I say it depends on the episode, right? But
yeah,
well, listeners, regardless of whether you and I are getting most out of it right now, listeners are getting all of it.
yeah.
Right. So as long as there's something in it for listeners, I think it's valuable, right? But it depends on the guests, right? You never
Yeah.
know where the conversation takes place.
And it's like non-linear, but my point of that is just like you can't really tell either, right? Like there's some transactions like there's another good framework here as well, which is like the transactional versus the transformational. And a lot of people don't like to be transactional, and I think that makes sense as well. But sometimes you just need to be transactional, particularly if you're in business. But then there's also transformational as well, and like the podcast is very transformational. That if you start down a path of inquiry and you bring other people, it can be some of the most like psychedelic types of things to invite people and come share openly about whatever they're working on, because they will absolutely influence you and transform you. And this goes back to our like that interdependence thing, is that like we're socially mediated humans. Like, we're group animals. We're social animals. We're not able to be. I tried to do this in 2020. I tried to go out and be as independent as possible, to go out into the woods and take trips into the woods on my own. And then during the day it'd be great. And then the night would fall, and I'd be like, "Oh shit! Like, where am I? I'm out here in the middle of nowhere. Where's my tribe? Where's all the people that it would like? It was totally like insane. Like, you can go insane if you go off and try to be on your own all the time. And so like we're fundamentally interdependent. So a podcast can essentially help you to grow and transform, basically.
I mean, I think that sums it up, right? And yeah, but what do you get over the fear of starting a podcast?
Yeah, that's an interesting one too. And I would, if anybody's interested in starting a podcast, I wouldn't try to start a podcast. I would record 9 interviews. The average length, at least a couple of years ago, of a podcast is 9 episodes. So if you do 9 episodes and you're like, oh, I want to do the 10th one, then you start the podcast. But really don't put too much thought into it. Just do it. Essentially, like that's I like that. If your goal is to learn, as both of us have this goal, I think that's the way I would suggest. If your goal is to actually like create like a high value media property, like you mentioned it earlier, My First Million or something like that, then I would suggest actually record all the episodes, get the audio engineer, spend a significant amount of money, and think about your brand, test out your brand, do all these different things. But those are 2 different parts, like two different intentions.
So figure out why you're doing it. And if you're doing it for learning for yourself, just dive into it, right? If you're trying to do proper media production, think about it some more, figure that route out. But then, do you just publish nowadays when you finish recording?
No, I don't. And I've actually figured out a system for this. So I've hired various people at times, but the more you hire and the more you spend, it raises the price of each podcast. And I do a lot of podcasts. There's sometimes where I've done like 2 podcasts a day, and so like I would have spent thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars if I had hired people. But now I'm down in Argentina. Argentina is quite cheap. There's also a lot of highly educated people, so I've found somebody to help me publish the podcast. And also AI has significantly reduced the amount of work required in the show notes as well. So now I've got a system where I have a Notion list. Every time I record a podcast, I just put it up there on the Notion list, and then this person goes and does all the AI processing to it, which then creates the show notes and such.
Sounds good. But let's now talk, to finish it off, about the crazy wisdom offline. So you've done a few of them so far, from what I understand, right?
Yep.
What was the feedback so far from the people who tried it?
It's really interesting. So the first one, I was like, my client proposed this idea to me. I actually went to him. He had posted about a copywriting job, and so I just wanted to see whether I could do that copywriting job. And he's like, "Oh no, I already hired somebody, but I want to hire you to do a private podcast with me because I'm thinking about these things, I'm talking about these things, and I need to hand something off to my copywriter. So I want to record a private podcast with you." First time was really interesting. As soon as I was doing it, I was like, "Oh, this is perfect," because I'm the type of person that it doesn't like. I think I've been relatively open on this podcast. I'm not too different when the recording button is on versus when it's off, but that is not something that's normal. Like that's something that it always hasn't always been that way either. So when I'm allowed to go fully off the record with somebody who's also interested in going off the record, that creates this beautiful synchronicity where it's totally open, like where there's no restrictions. We don't have to think about what's being put out in public. So that allows me to ask questions that I'm most curious about, because the problem with curiosity is that like it needs to be unrestricted in order to allow for it, which is why totalitarian regimes have such a problem with curious people. But yeah.
So what does it end up sounding like? Like, is it just a conversation between two friends where you keep asking questions, poking at ideas?
So the first one was just a podcast as private, but then at the end, he has a particular archetype in mind of the type of customers that he wants to bring in with the thoughts generated from the podcast. So by the second time, I was able to actually focus on that archetype. And that archetype is like a CEO of a 1,000-person company. And so then the second time was very much, I would go on these tangents and then I would realize that's not important for the focus of this thing. So it became very focused on how do we actually do that. And then by the end of that one, he did say this was a 5 out of 5, definitely repeat. He scheduled another one. And then by that moment, I was like, okay, this is a real business. This is a real value. And it's been so long. I've been trying to figure out how to make money doing podcasts, and finally found it.
No, I gotta say, I really love it. I mean, like, I kind of want to try this, right?
Yeah.
Because I had a similar experience where I'm putting together a course on AI for executives, and then I was chatting with a friend who runs a $100 million company, and he goes, the course is great, but maybe instead of doing the course, just send like a preview to all these executives and just go visit them in their office and like do so much more. But it's the same idea, because I like asking questions, I like talking to people, and so that goes back to your question just a few minutes ago, like who gets the most value, right?
Yeah.
Well, you get all the value from learning everything you hear. They get all the value from figuring out how to position their thoughts and capture them. Yeah. So how can people book you? Find you on LinkedIn? Well, we'll link to stuff below, but
yeah, find me on LinkedIn. I'm Stewart Alsop, STEWARTALSOP. There's a few of us, but I'm the younger one. And you can also find me on Twitter as well, Stewart Alsop III on Twitter. And of course, the podcast is Crazy Wisdom. And yeah,
that's awesome. Well, I could probably chat with you, for a while, and I think I should come to Argentina and hang out with you at one of those Argentinian dinners, and we'll hit record. We'll do a live stream. We'll just talk for 6 hours into the wee hours of the night. But so far, I really enjoyed this. I think it's been great. I'm going to link to all of your shows, probably recent episodes, what have you. Are there any particularly super favorite episodes that you want to mention?
Yeah, I actually did one really interesting. So there is the new series that I'm starting with my dad. That's a really interesting one. At first we were just going to interview. We actually interviewed Steve Case of AOL recently, and a whole bunch of other people who were really influential in the 1980s and the 1990s and the 2000s. And so we're both going to start our own podcast called Stewart Squared. And I've published a few of those episodes, like the one with Steve Case recently. Yeah, I've done a lot of episodes, actually science fiction to reality, the technologies that will shape our future. That one I did with Ash Jogalaker, who is an academic at a university and who had the pleasure of working with Freeman Dyson, who is the Dyson Sphere guy. And so that was a really wild conversation. So I point to that one as well. But yeah, there's I think I'm, as you mentioned, I have 360 episodes. Like I'm now, and I've got both of my father and my grandfather are journalists, so this is like in my blood, and now I've really done it so many times. So yeah, I'm very excited about a lot of the stuff that's out there.
That's awesome. We'll link to everything. I do think people should go and browse and see if they see familiar names of the stories and what have you, right? Because there's so much crazy wisdom inside your podcast. And I think if you're going a long walk and a long drive, definitely check out Crazy Wisdom Podcast and see what's there for you. Otherwise, thank you for coming. It's been awesome. I had a great time. I think we should do this again sometime soon. And enjoy Argentina. Keep us updated. And if you find some new interesting people in Argentina, please bring them on your podcast. Maybe you can get Malay to come. Um, he's there
Well,
somewhere. It's
and
only
that
one
does remind
email
me,
away.
and I do have crazy wisdom in Espanol too as well. So if you speak Spanish, I have started it in Spanish, and it is cool because now I'm able to like cross the linguistic border. Yeah.
And now you can use AI to go both ways, where Crazy Wisdom in Espanol can become an English
Go into
version.
English. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, sir.